Hey class, I'm going to do a little YouTube video here instead of just an audio because I think having some text will help a little bit. If nothing else, it'll help me keep my mind straight. Excuse me. As I go through the topics that I think are relevant for you in the simulation. So here are some concepts that, having done this thing or watched people go through it so many times, I know are important. It's up to you, though, to determine exactly how they're important. I'll give you some, I think, good guidance, but basically, you should be wading through this on your own with the knowledge that you've accumulated up to this point. So understand this product all around. Uh, Appreciate its level of brand equity. I can tell you that if you think of, you don't have to think too hard to figure out what product this might be in the marketplace. It seems to me that it's very similar to NyQuil. Uh, so in that respect or in that regard, what is your brand equity and what is the significance of brand equity? It relates to number 3 on that list of pricing power, but it also ties into the level of customer awareness and satisfaction. And there's figures in there for each of those. Uh, I didn't log into or double check what they were, so I'll speak from what I recall. Don't take my numbers as being the starting numbers in the simulation. But I think your level of satisfaction was somewhere around 70, and the level of awareness was something on the order of 72 or 3 or 4. I can't remember. It doesn't matter that I don't know the exact number. Um, More importantly, though, might ask yourself uh, the actual value of those numbers. So is 74% awareness, if we assume that's the number for awareness, is that adequate? To what extent should you be trying to improve that number? And I will give you a quick example and say that Ronald McDonald is the most commonly known character of sorts after Santa Claus. Something on the order of, and again, I don't remember exactly, but I think 96% plus or minus. So that's of great value to McDonald's, but at the same time, you can ask yourself, do they have 96% of the market? And the answer is no, they don't. Uh, and so you have to make sort of a judgment call on what is a good number, and then decide whether or not you want to improve on that number or you want to maintain that number. The same thing's true with satisfaction, which is even more important in a sense, isn't it? Uh, because it's one thing to know about a product; it's another thing to apply whether or not you actually like it. I mean, the worst kind of awareness is awareness because you think a product or a brand is lousy. So it's the same thing. What is a reasonable level of satisfaction to aspire to? This should be part of your strategy. It's one of the metrics that you focus on. Uh, and when I'll speak to it in a minute, you got to tie it back to product life cycle, your best guess of how long this product's been around, and how long it's taken them to achieve these numbers, albeit whether or not these numbers are good, uh, and then decide whether or not, again, your strategy is to improve on them or to maintain them, because that's two very different strategies, two very different metrics. So if you want to improve awareness to 96%, which I would discourage any of you from doing, because in economics they teach us there's a point of diminishing returns where where for $1 spent, for some reason, you don't get $1 in return. And so there's a metric in your profit and loss under performance that you can look at. And if that number, and again, I don't have it in front of me, but it's about halfway down on page 1. And it really is if you can identify it, is a statement of the efficiency of your advertising. I think it calls that. I mean, if it's above 1, I believe, like if it's 2, I personally take that as implying that if it's for every dollar spent, you're getting 2 back. So you can view it like that. If you read the manual, there may be a slightly different interpretation, but fundamentally, you want to identify a metric that does in fact provide you the ROI on this menu of promotional activities and strategies that you're employing or developing. Okay, so pricing power. What is pricing power? That's your ability to raise prices in the marketplace, the extent to which the pricing on your product is elastic or inelastic, and you have to get a sense of that for your product. And what's really important that relates to that is the margin that you have between your MSRP and your actual production costs. And in your pricing decision, it tells you, if I'm not mistaken, what the margin is. If you can't find that, then you need to go look at that profit and loss and figure out how to determine the margin on an individual unit basis, which at this point again in time, you all should be able to do. What's the value of that? Well, for those of you that want to decrease the price, for example, you better know the extent. If you want to lower the MSRP by 50 cents and your margin is $1, you just cut your margin by 50%. You have to really understand the connection between cause and effect of these decisions that you do, which is why I would tell you, just don't be doing this stuff helter-skelter, or this thing will eat you alive. You have to really get to a point of understanding it well enough, these cause and effects relationships, that you're making your decisions strategically, because that's the way it's done in the marketplace by those companies and brands that are successful. They just don't do stuff. And then how does inflation factor into that? I can tell you this, and I'm giving away a little bit on this stuff, but that's okay. You start out as a low-level marketing person in this simulation, and then by the time you have done a few, everyone is supposedly a year. So after 6 years, you're the poobah, and you're calling the shots. So let's start out assuming I'm your boss, and within a few years, you've booted my tired old sorry hiney out of here. So margin and inflation. If inflation is, let's say, 4%, and you choose not to raise your starting $5.29 price at all for the following year, and your margin is $1, so you're selling it for $5.29, and out of that you make $1, and inflation is 4%, and you don't raise the price. 4% of $5.29 is 20 some odd cents, so it's 20 cents off of the margin of $1. So basically, if inflation is 5, it's cut into your margin by 20%. These are the things really that you got to understand, and be sensitive to. That's why firms spend so much time in, the supply chain management, in trying to cut costs of different kinds, as well as in your promotional campaign. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's labor, it's materials, but there's always this game of trying to lower your production costs. But one of the worst things that students often fall into is just lowering prices, assuming you can do that without a deleterious effect or impact on your bottom line. So that's all I'll say about that. Uh, you want to know the stage of the product life cycle and the different recommendations in theory that come with the product life cycle. That's a big factor uh, in this simulation because this is a consumer product. And so you have to take a best guess on where this thing might be. I mean, it's been going on for at least 5 or 6 years, you could guess, because it has 24% of the market uh, share. And so it's been around a little while. Market share is another thing. Are you going to try to grow market share? Or are you going to try to protect market share? Two different strategies. Each cost different amounts of money and require different promotional strategies. But I would tell you as a parallel that Coke and Pepsi really don't try to take market share away from each other anymore. They've both been around a long time and they've got uh, their share of loyal followers. What they do try to do is they try to maintain market share through different strategies. And I could give you an entire lecture on that one, but you don't want me to, and I don't want to. So I won't. But on that product life cycle, it tells you that when you're introducing a new product, that you want to push it into the marketplace. And there's two ways to do that: samples and salespeople. So if you want to grow into a new market, uh, it's all about samples and more salespeople to do it. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. So essentially, you can do the following in uh, this three practice things. You want to set it up as an experiment because you can do advertising and you can do more advertising. You can increase salespeople, and or you can increase the price. And the extent that you maybe can or cannot raise price depends on your evaluated uh, pricing power and brand equity. Okay, that said, again, you can do three things. You can do nothing. You could raise the price, leave everything else the same. You could increase the salespeople, leave everything else the same. Or you could do a combination of those two above, raise price and salespeople. So you might try this. Hold everything else the same and raise the price. How much? I'm not going to tell you, but I told you something about inflation, which should set the bar at some point. Do you have pricing power to raise it $2? No. No, you'd price yourself right out of the marketplace if you did something like that. It's always scope and scale, but it might be inflation plus a couple percent if you have pricing power at this point in time. Or you can try lowering it and getting new customers. That's penetration pricing. But you better know what you're doing as far as margins, because at least you could expect in the subsequent period that you might increase the number of customers that you have, maybe even total dollar sales, but you could very easily reduce your profit. It's all based on the numbers that you actually select. Okay, so First, you could raise the price, leave everything else constant. Second, leave everything else constant, but raise the number of salespeople some amount. And third, you could do a combination of the two after you've seen what the results are of those other two decisions. So if you increase the number of salespeople by 100 and showed a huge loss or negative effect, which you probably would, because again, it's scope and scale, it's finding the sweet spot, then in the third decision, you'd probably lower that somewhat. If you raise it one or two salespeople, I would say remember the adage, you have to spend money to make money. So your task is to figure out setting it up as an experiment of trying to find some level that is where you'll get a positive bump in your performance metrics, which is primarily stock price and accumulated net. So finally, you also want to have a strategy, stated objectives. For those of you that have taken classes from me, whenever I can, I say any good objective is a quantified objective, because if it's not quantified, you can't track it. And so it's not enough to say, I want my stock price to go up. I mean, how much do you want it to go up? If it only went up, if it was $50 and went up 50 cents, I don't think you're going to get that promotion in the first year. So you might say, set targets for these different things you're going to do. Set targets through a given period. For example, you might say by period 6, I will have 350 salespeople. And then say that equates to X amount per year. And so you set that as sort of a strategy on a target. It's for some point in the future. And then you reevaluate it annually. So, if you're happy with 30 people or you're happy with 50 people in the response, you can maybe do the same thing the next year. If you didn't quite get the impact that you wanted, you might want to up it or lower it based on what happened. But I can tell you that salespeople, for example, there is a point at which you're spending all your promotional dollars on one thing, and so that can have negative effects overall. So if you raised them 100 and your stock price went to hell, and then you say, well, Dr. Duncan told me to do that. No, I didn't tell you to do that. I said you have to be calculated. You have to find the sweet spot. I know what it is. I'm not going to tell you. But setting this up like this will give you some points before you get started that will give you clues, at least through the first couple decisions on how to maximize this trial and apply it to your first 2 or 3 decisions. Hope that makes sense. And last slide, other factors that affect your performance results through the simulation. Be sure to understand who your customer segments are and the needs of each. This is important when you're deciding on new products. And remember the product life cycle and how it applies, what it tells you to do when you launch a new product. The best way to launch a new product, whether it's a Thai restaurant in a neighborhood or a new cold medicine, is to give out samples. The fact is that Advertising doesn't really work well for most products until until customers or the market becomes aware of the product. So there are other ways to there are other mechanisms to utilize that are more effective in the beginning than advertising to getting people to know about your product or service. Uh, know who your competitors are. I could tell you who they are, but again, based on the information and the reports that are in there, you need to discern or figure out who your competitors are. If you go back to NyQuil, I don't even know if there's a competitor. They kind of own the upper end of the market, but there's all kinds of wannabes, the generics that Walmart does or Walgreens does. You know, they have their own generic brands, and they come out with cheaper alternatives. But you know, aspirin is aspirin. Is aspirin is aspirin is aspirin. To take a Bayer or to take a generic is exactly the same. But people pay more for Bayer because Bayer has spent a lot of money convincing customers that it's better, that it has, that it that it suffices for different ailments better than any other choices. It doesn't, but as you know, its perception is 95% reality, something like that. So uh, if people believe it to be better, they'll pay for it. Know who your competitors are. Okay, I said that. Don't say things in your ads that aren't true about your product. You get dinged on this when you have been promoted by the fourth, fifth, sixth uh, year. You have the ability to say what your ads are going to emphasize. You know, what are going to be the messages. And um, I'll just tell you that you want to make sure that your product does what you say it's going to do. If not, you lose customers. If you don't meet the needs you say you're going to meet, then you will lose customers. There's lots of other little nuances in this thing that make a difference, but at least in the beginning, uh, if you want to get off to the right step, you want to be setting your price levels reasonably correctly, and there's a range of correctness, and the same holds true for the number of salespeople. So good luck. If you have questions, I'm happy to ask. When I read your evaluations of your decisions for a particular period, the 25-point assignments, if they don't make sense, you know, I don't grade you very highly on them. And so you really have to think about these strategies. Again, if you're just doing them, you're not going to do well. So anyway, good luck, and I hope everybody stock is 125 by the 6th or 7th period, and you're making all the money in the world.